Sorry, I don't love you. Afraid I've grown accustomed to. Cause with you something isn't wrong, something isn't wrong, something isn't right. I wish you could be happy.
Hey everyone, welcome to Geekdom is back. We have a brand new guest this week. Julie Linzor is joining me to talk all about Captain America, the First Avenger. Before we dive in though, I just want to let you all know that this episode is sponsored by lootcrate.com, and we will have 10% savings for you on any new subscription at trylootcrate.com/geekdompod. And the code for that is Bridge10. I'll have it in the show notes and everything. You don't even have to remember it. But we're going to dive into the topic right now. Julie, how are you doing today?
Good. Excited to be here.
Awesome. And I rewatched this film literally this morning, just so it would definitely be fresh for me. And I know you are a big Team Cap person, so it felt like a good fit to have you on. And for those who might not know, I've been writing for Hidden Remote for a bit now, and that's how I know Julie, through the lovely Slack group that they have going there.
Yes, that's new actually. We just started doing that recently, so it's been really beneficial.
Yeah, it's like I came on right at the right time, because I was just like, I really want like an active Slack group to be in, because I had a friend who tried to set one up for a bunch of music industry people, and it like got going for maybe a week or so and then just very quickly fizzled out. So I'm glad this one's sort of still going strong and everything like that. But today, Captain America, the First Avenger, the very first Captain America movie from 2011. I was thinking about it. I was like, wow, this came out the year I graduated from high school. So I apologize if I just made anyone feel old. But it also doesn't feel that long ago. Like 6 years isn't a very long time. We've just had so many movies since then that it feels like this movie was much longer ago than it actually was. And Julie, I want to start off by talking about the casting choices, since this was the first Captain America movie. That seems like a pretty good place to start, because then we see these characters in future movies, obviously, and Chris Evans went from being in the Fantastic Four to being Captain America, which I think was probably the best career choice he made.
Actually, he almost turned down the part. He almost said no when they offered him Captain America, because he has pretty bad anxiety that he's really, really open about. Right. And he almost said no. And then actually what stopped him from saying no was the fact that he was like, am I going to let this opportunity pass by, because I don't want to deal with what happens when you're famous. And that kind of changed the context of why he was saying no. And so when he like finally accepted it, it was pretty interesting, all of his interviews after that, because he was like, yeah, well, I almost wasn't. And then for a little while, he also kept telling people that he couldn't be Captain America forever because his hairline was receding. And I thought that was really, really funny, because at one point I was talking about it with a group of people, and I was like, oh yeah, he keeps coming up with a different excuse. And they were like, a hairline receding is like nothing. And I was like, it's really funny that like, I think now it's become like a joke that like, oh, he wasn't going to do it, and it was so successful and such a good choice. I mean, I'm sitting here in a Captain America shirt right now. So like, that's like the level like we are at. But it's reached its own, it's very meta in a way. Disney, I don't know, I think they incubate all the Chris's in a lab or something, because every single one of them not only suits the role that they're chosen for, but it feels like it like collapses in on itself. Like you're like, oh, I don't know why I didn't think of that, every single time. And everyone in that movie is superbly cast. I mean, you could go, start at Chris Evans, but I mean everyone. Haley Atwell also, she wasn't anyone. But yeah. You have even background characters who, like Jenna Coleman, is famous now, and she was just one of the dates to the dance that Bucky brought before he shipped off. So but that's where Captain America itself, I've found that the movie itself has gotten better because of the sequels that have built on it. So, you look back and you're like, oh, wow, I didn't even notice, the continuity is just almost flawless.
Yeah, and we've seen Chris Evans as Captain America fully in 5 movies, and I know he has some little uncredited scenes, and spoiler alert, obviously, for not only this movie, but also a Spider-Man Homecoming, real quick here. He does PSAs in there, so he's credited in the Spider-Man movie, even though he's not really in it. So we see him pop up in all these different places, and he's obviously a huge part of the Avengers
He was
too.
in Thor Dark World also
Yeah.
because Loki changes into him. He was the big cameo of that movie. Um, which that's the other thing, his own movie takes place so far in the past that there aren't cameos. The cameo is the Tesseract, I guess, because his whole movie sets up for so much story.
Yeah, and obviously Stanley is going to do his little cameos in every single movie. So
Oh yeah.
that's expected though, so it's not really a surprise. It's just kind of like, oh, what's Stan going to do next? And it's one of those things, but this ended up making 370.6 million worldwide, and when you think about it, this was still really Marvel getting their bearings and everything with these big blockbuster movies because Iron Man, I believe, was in 2008, and The Incredible Hulk, and then you got Iron Man 2 even before this, I think. So
Yeah,
it's just, they were still sort of getting a feel.
Thor also came out before Captain America.
Yeah, to me that seems like a interesting choice because I feel like Thor maybe isn't quite as popular as far as the Avengers characters go. And to have something like the Incredible Hulk and Thor come out before Captain America, looking back on it now, it's just kind of like, huh, that was interesting. And I think with this one, they sort of really started to figure out where they wanted to go. And like you said, it's quite a bit of setup and everything like that. So we're getting, him and Peggy Carter, and we even get Dum Dum Dugan in this movie, and at the very end, we get Nick Fury. And I think the fact that they sort of took the time to introduce Nick Fury was a smart choice, especially because he wasn't around in that time period in the, first portion of the movie and everything, or the main portion of the movie, I should say. And looking back on the movie, there's definitely a lot more things I noticed that I probably didn't notice, like in the midst of the hype for the movie and everything like that. And after seeing so many more Marvel movies since then, looking back on some, you're just kind of like, yeah, maybe they weren't quite as good as I thought, but you also have to
Yeah.
remember they weren't as good at it yet as they are now. So I think, let's talk about the storyline very briefly here, actually. Red Skull is sort of the main villain here, and I found with a lot of superhero movies, sometimes the villains fall flat for me, and I wouldn't necessarily say Red Skull did that here, but it's just like, it kind of felt like there was all this build up to the character, and then it was just like, all right, he's here. And it's like, you kind of know it from the beginning. What did you think about the choice for Red Skull to be the villain for the first Captain America movie?
So because the war itself, I mean, Steve's nature in general was just to get there and to fight. He felt left out, but he just he wanted to stop the bullies. And I think that again, I feel like Red Skull is better now than he was when I first saw the movie, actually, because now all of the struggles that occurred with the super soldier serum, and especially what continued to happen to the super soldier serum, like with Bucky. And I think that in the first time I saw the movie, I was not impressed at all, actually.
Okay.
And I will openly tell people that movie is boring.
Right.
There's a lot that happens, and the pacing is really bad. For, like you said, they were figuring themselves out,
Yeah.
but there's so much like that the scene where they won't let him do anything, so he's a part of the chorus line
Yeah.
that goes on forever. You could literally fast forward it, because it by the time they get to the Howling Commandos and all of that stuff, you've had enough. Everyone's had enough, and I don't think that was their intent. I don't think that they
Right.
were trying to irritate everyone, but you really do sit there and go, oh, everyone complains. Everyone complains about every superhero movie. Oh, there wasn't enough action, and I'm not sure what that means in certain contexts of certain movies, because like without the dialogue, the action doesn't make sense.
Right.
And so they had to make us fall in love with pre-serum Steve. So I get all the time spent before that, but after, I feel like one or two showing him going around, we didn't need a whole, I mean, that montage lasts like 20 minutes, it feels like, if
Yeah.
not that. A good chunk of the movie is used just showing him going to different states and talking to people, and you really, there starts to be a disconnect, I felt like, between the start of the movie and the middle of the movie. And I mean, it's pretty common for the second act and everything to have issues. But what was interesting about Red Skull specifically in the larger story is that it wasn't about him, it was about Hydra, which has become like a focal point still. And I think that having an actual face to pin on Hydra was really what Disney was after. So whenever the name is mentioned and everything like that, now we know, it's this huge organization. But back when, during World War II, for Stephen and Peggy and the rest of the Howling Commandos to have someone to lay the blame on, it made it a little easier. What was really not good about the entire arc of the character is that I so much rested on how he looked that other than that, there's very little substance to him. He first of all, he comes in and he goes out by the last couple of minutes of the movie, and it's very like anticlimactic in a lot of ways.
Right.
The climax is that he has to go down with the plane, so I don't know if their intent was to leave you wanting more, which might have been, in which case they succeeded. But you finish Captain America and you're kind of like, okay, what's next? Which we know what next. But I think that with that being so much of the focus, they lost a little bit of the story in between. I mean, now also they have a pretty, packed group of writers and directors, and you pretty much know who's going to be doing what. So yeah, they were getting their bearings, but at the same time, like, they'd done, like you said, three movies. Yeah, they had done 3 movies before that. They should have been a little bit more on their way.
Yeah, they might have even done 4 with the 2 Iron Mans and then Hulk and Thor, unless we just want to disregard Hulk. But
I don't speak of it. I mean,
it's one of those things.
I think that was just a colossal failure, and yet they still won't give us a Black Widow movie. That can fail all at once. But
Yeah. But to go back to your point about the pacing problem too, I really felt that with the opening of the movie. I forgot that it started with introducing us to Hydra, basically. And for me, I think the movie could have started with the movie theater scene where we first see Steve. And then I think starting off with him might have felt better for the pacing, because you're seeing all this stuff in the beginning of the very first Captain America movie and you're not really entirely sure what's going on or why this has any significance. So I think they could have just sort of either taken that out altogether, because I think even without that opening, we still would have had a good understanding of what was going on. had we started from that movie theater scene and sort of just see Steve get into the military and meet Peggy Carter and everything like that. And for me too, I feel like some of the best scenes from this movie were simply the scenes with Steve and Peggy together. You know, that scene in the car before he's this super soldier and everything, it was just so much of what both of those characters stand for. Even before he became Captain America, I was like, okay, this is what they got right in this movie. And I think that relationship that they built throughout it, and they kind of let it build up all the way until when he gets on the plane to get Red Skull.
Right. Well, I think what works so well is the way Steve interacts with people, and I agree because about the start of the movie, because the other thing is that it actually starts in present day when they find him and they go, oh my god, he's alive, and then it gets real confusing because you go back to the past and it's not the past where you're interacting with Steve at all. By the time
Right.
you do, you're like, okay, they've set me up for his intro, and you're ready for it, and then you're still left like waiting a little bit. But what was so true about the movie and what has maintained it is that relationship between, you know, Peggy and Steve. They're and a lot of people, not to go into Agent Carter and everything, but a lot of people had issue with the fact that the first season of Agent Carter relied so heavily on a little bit of like a Captain America plot. But I found that they did what worked best. And the one thing about Peggy and Steve is that, like, Peggy carries around a picture of pre-serum Steve. You know, while yes, there's that famous scene where she touches him after he comes out of, you know, the machine and he's all muscly now, it's not their entire bond and relationship and everything they taught each other doesn't that started, you know, when he managed to get himself into boot camp and, you know, jumped on the grenade. You know, that started when people were underestimating them both. And what I really like about it is how easily it's maintained. You know, when my favorite line of the movie will forever always be, "Do you fondue?" And then because it's so Steve, you know, he even when especially because that scene in particular occurs after Bucky is like, "Oh, I'm you." Like, no, Bucky is smooth and knows how to talk to girls, and Steve will always be pre-serum Steve. And the fact that they were able to maintain that in the same way they were able to maintain the Bucky and Steve bond that's been so crucial to other movies as well, it's the most wholesome part of Steve. You know, he didn't ask to be a super soldier. It just kind of happened, but he took up what he knew how to do best and went ahead. You know, he would have done it if he was small. He would have died, but he would have done it. And I mean, that's what made him special to begin with. But the fact that the there's so much time is like a huge theme in superhero movies too.
Yeah.
And it's a huge theme. And you know, the fact that when he goes and sees Peggy again in Winter Soldier, that, you know, everyone has the same reaction. They're like, "Oh, Peggy," because it's not just what she meant to Steve. It's what he meant to her, and it's their entire history, you know, and not because of what they went through. You know, it's because of, you know, again, that everyone just totally underestimated them. She was a woman, and, you know, and disrespected. That's the first Peggy scene we get. She punches someone in the face. It's
Right.
fantastic. You know, and he, you know, he was the underdog. He was the little guy, and so the fact that, you know, when he's not really like a little guy anymore, he's still that's his fighting spirit. He'll always, fight for that person, which is why it's so interesting to have seen him evolve since those movies, because, that's why Bucky is so important to him. I mean, he just keeps losing people. That's part of it.
Yeah, and I can't believe after rewatching it, I still forgot about the opening scene where they find him in ice. Because to me, it's like the movie really starts when they go back to introducing Hydra and everything. So I think that just sort of goes to show that not every superhero movie needs to be over 2 hours just
No.
because they want to pack all this stuff. And I mean, this one came in right around 2 hours, so it's actually one of the shorter superhero films. At least I'm pretty sure it's one on the shorter end. And, for me, I was thinking about this somewhat recently. I was like, whatever happened to the movies that were like 90 to 100 minutes and just sort of
Yeah,
perfectly fit in everything they wanted to fit in? I feel like something like this could have benefited by a 20-minute cut or something like that. Like you said, making that
absolutely.
montage scene shorter, making that introduction to Hydra shorter, and sort of just giving us a little more of Steve to start the movie, I think really would have helped this. And while there's a lot that doesn't work super well for this movie, there's still enough that works well to push it forward and bring us the Avengers and everything like that. And because they had already introduced Iron Man, Hulk, Thor, and now Captain America, that sort of just made sense as the next move. And for me personally, I think I probably enjoy the Winter Soldier the most out of all of the Captain America films. And I think it's just because that's when they really, got that core group of, like you said, directors, writers, and everything. And they sort of had things down by then for sure. And I think what did it for me in this was simply the fact that Haley Atwell played Peggy Carter so well, and I think she was able to bring out more in Chris Evans as Steve Rogers than
She could
maybe
act
any.
against a rock.
Yeah.
She's
Yeah, so did you actually know anything about Captain America going into this? Because for me personally, I've been getting really into comics more so, I want to say, in the last 2 or 3 years than anything else. So, back in 2011, I probably hadn't read more than a handful of comics, if that, and I don't think any of them were Captain America comics if I had read some. So I think, these movies just do a good job of getting people to dive into the superhero and comic book culture. And I know for me, the movies did play a big role in that. But do you read the comics? Did you know about Captain America before this?
I had not read the comics, but I did know about him before for a couple of reasons. Well, first, I'm going to age myself because you mentioned that the movie came out when you graduated high school. The movie came out while I was in college,
Okay.
and uh, I remember when Iron Man came out, I distinctly remember going, "Oh, this is so like something." I always liked Batman and all of that stuff, so it was kind of like, "Oh, of course, this is something I would be interested in." But my scope of knowledge, as far as like Iron Man went, I really didn't know much, and Robert Downey Jr. did a really good job of making me go, "Oh, okay, I need to go investigate some of this." Now, with Captain America, you kind of always know who he is. Like, I feel like it's just one of those things that like you're aware of it, but you don't
Right.
necessarily like know about him. And I I can tell you, like, I wasn't interested, like, when the Fantastic Four was going on and stuff like that, I was not into any of that kind of stuff. I was not curious about it. It didn't strike my interest. By the time that Captain America came out, I had seen all the other movies, and I knew a little bit more about him at that by then than I did about any of the other comic characters for a couple of reasons. One was that Stanley created him to, fight the Nazis. And that was always like an interesting talking point, especially while you're in school. It's like a great way to get people to like pay attention and stuff like that. So, the rise of comic book culture and its forms of media has been happening for a while. And so he had an advantage because of the character he was playing, but I really didn't know very much about Steve Rogers. And then after seeing it, I like the movie itself didn't impress me, and I was much more interested in the Avengers just because I was curious to see them all together. And then it was more the Avengers that made me start to like investigate like Steve and everything like that, at least in his comic book form. And one of the interesting things about him is that, the stories themselves, I mean, he was created, by a little Jewish kid who wanted to like, who wanted someone to protect him. And, that's very similar origins in a way to the two guys that created Superman as well. And it's such a fascinating thing to study because you have it's its own relic of the past. It's its own way of understanding what the feelings were in World War II and stuff like that. But then I didn't really want to go too deep because Peggy Carter in the comics is not very likable. She is actually quite annoying. And she's very much like obsessed with Steve in the way that comic book writers tend to write women. So I kind of felt like I was happier with Disney's version, which is usually the case with most of their stuff anyway. I was happier to accept Disney's version than to like tarnish what I already knew. And what's interesting is they kind of fell back on a little bit of like a bad habit with introducing Sharon Carter at all. And I think that's interesting. I think that there's its own reasoning for that, but I do think some of the expectations of the comics do affect what they choose to do and don't do in the movies. And I think that plays an interesting role in how the rest of the world is, created. Like I said, the movie was so bent on explaining how the Avengers came to be that I think that it lost sight of itself a little bit because, I think that's why we spend so much time with the Tesseract, so that when Loki's running around New York wielding it, it's not like this mysterious object. We're supposed to be afraid of it. We're supposed to be upset that it's, that Steve and the Tesseract came out of the ice, and I think that's where some of the, origin stories are hard.
Yeah.
and very few movies get it right. Iron Man got it right. Wonder Woman got it right. They're hard. We know these stories, that's why, Spider-Man had such a hard time to begin with. We've seen, oh my God, if I had to see another Uncle Ben, I would not have handled it well. You know what I mean? You get bored of the, all of these superheroes have origin stories, except for maybe T'Challa and Thor, who are just like, they're born that way. And I think that, where Captain America had the advantage, it also had the disadvantage. And, the other thing is that people weren't used to even in 2011, which wasn't that long ago, like the steady pace of these movies, in the sense that, like, yes, we get like 2-3 a year, and there was like a lot of fatigue. I remember, like, oh, another one. And it's hard not to fall back on that too. Like, oh, okay, well, we already know about Captain America. We know that, he became a super soldier, and, that's his power. And, he's patriotic and truth, justice, and all of that stuff. And I think that's why, like, the movie itself had so many issues in terms of viewing it, because you're fatigued, you're bored, and there's not, like, I don't know, I feel like like you said, if the movie had been cut by a lot, it would have changed a lot, actually. I think that they also could have upped some of the other characters, like Howard Stark could have been in it even a little bit more, I think, because young Howard is hysterical. And it also paints a picture for why Tony feels a certain way about Steve. It would have been interesting if this was the first movie instead of Iron Man.
Especially since this happens first in continuity, technically.
Yeah, I think that I think that people would have jumped on the bandwagon just as much, but it would have been interesting if this is what came out in 2008, because I think that some of the issues are that, it happened first, and you spend so much time, we're in the future minimally in that movie, almost not at all.
Yeah, like the last, maybe 5 minutes, if that.
Yeah, and I think that, and that's good. I mean, it would have been interesting to see, if Steve hadn't had to do that, it would have been interesting to see what would have happened, more. But I think the biggest problem is that it was an origin story, and by then, like we've mentioned, it's, we had a bunch already, and it's not as much fun. Never mind the fact that, like, all in the future, Tony's off having like a drinking problem, and like there was actual stuff going on,
Yeah.
And Thor and Loki in our own context had already happened, so we knew that like some really bad crap was about to go down. It felt like it was stalling a lot. The movie itself, the timing of the movie, they had to introduce him, but and I think that that's why I find it interesting, because going into the movie, you know who he is, but certainly they did a better job with Steve. I definitely didn't know much about Steve Rogers himself. Yeah. You think of him more, I think, on the level of like an alter ego than you would some of the other characters. And I think that that's part of what made learning who Steve is interesting, because like even when I talk about him, it's not like, oh, he's Captain America. No, he's Steve Rogers. That's the cusp of it. And I think that I think that's what makes learning about the story. Like when Winter Soldier came out, I did look up some stuff about that movie because I wanted to understand what might be happening in the context of the larger MCU. And your friend coming back from the dead would be traumatic for anyone, but the Bucky Steve thing is very, it's so different from some other stuff you see in movies, that like I needed to learn more about who, James Buchanan Barnes was, as opposed to Steve. And, that I think that's part of it too. Steve doesn't really need a lot of context. Like we know who he is because of who he is. He's, it's like Superman, but different. He happens to walk around with a shield and his name is Captain America. It's one of those things that like, I'm fairly sure his shield was on shirts before it was like on shirts. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
At least in my subconscious, it's, the marketing for Captain America has existed before the movie did, which would make sense. I mean, his, the comic books were very popular. But yeah, I think that I think that the live action version is a lot more intriguing. I think that there's a lot of depth that the actors themselves bring to these characters that make the more two-dimensional version difficult. I think that what's interesting is seeing, these comics get new writers and new editions all the time. And what's interesting is seeing, what the people who play them have to say when the comic does something ridiculous, like have Captain America be Hydra in some weird, alternate universe. And, and it was funny because Chris Evans tweeted, and he tweeted something like, "Say it ain't so." And like that was and even something like that, like, while yes, okay, he's the actor behind it, but at the same time, it's like you could see, like, if Steve Rogers learned how to use Twitter, like, that's how he would speak, and I think that that's part of what makes these characters so, like, I don't really separate the two. I can separate the comic and the movie, and I think one is better than the other, but I don't think that there's a whole lot of, like, separation between the character that Disney created and then the Chris Evans that Disney sends out into the world.
Yeah, and with the comics too, they get so many, I don't want to call them do-overs, but they just get so many different runs for the same character because the comics have been running a lot longer than we've had live action movies. So when they take storylines from the comics and then sort of change them into a way that works better for what they want to do with the movies, I think that's something that, while diehard comics fans aren't necessarily the most fond of, it's something that I think a lot of the general public will forgive them for. Like in Civil War, it doesn't end at all the same way that it does in the comics and everything like that. But if they had it end that same way, they wouldn't be able to move forward with the same plan they had for the movies. And I think, as someone who really enjoys both the movies and the comics, I definitely don't take it, personally or anything when they don't do exactly what the comics did, because I feel like that would sort of just be boring. It's like, okay, well, I already have the comics, so why do I need a movie of the exact same thing? And I think what they're doing now is probably better because you're getting these characters, but you're still getting two different versions of them. Like, I don't think we'll see the Hydra Cap anytime soon in the movies or anything like that. And I think that's fine because there are so many villains you can pluck out of the comics, and they make really great transitions into the cinematic world and everything like that. And I think with Captain America, I admittedly haven't read too many Captain America solo comics, but I have read some Avenger stuff, and it's definitely a very different dynamic because you have all of these alpha males and Black Widow in the Avengers, and it's like, okay, Tony wants to be in charge, but Cap is Cap. And it's like you get this totally different dynamic. But when you just have the Captain America solo movies, and obviously Civil War felt a lot more like an Avengers movie. Like, sometimes I forget that was a Captain America movie just because it had literally everyone in it. So
Chris Hemsworth hasn't. He hasn't forgotten. He won't. He's mad at the Russo brothers. Thor wasn't included.
that is true, but then they put Ant-Man in it instead, and then gave us the introduction to Spider-Man. So there was a lot going on in that film, but I think with this and the Winter Soldier, they sort of try to find that balance between the comics and what they want to do with the movies. And while I don't think they necessarily hit it out of the park by any means with the first movie, I think they grabbed people just enough to keep them going to the movies. And I think then with Avengers, that's sort of when they started to sort of scale things up and everything. And then the Russo brothers did the second Captain America film, and it seems like people aren't quite as tired of these movies as they maybe seemed like they were at the beginning, like you said. And I do want to talk about some of the effects and everything, but before we get into that, I want to let you all know a little more about Loot Crate. So for all of you listeners of Welcome to Geekdom, Loot Crate is offering an opportunity to save 10% on any new subscription. You can go to trylootcrate.com/geekdompod and enter the code BRIDGE10, like I mentioned at the beginning. That'll be in the show notes. You definitely do not have to remember it. But if you have not seen anything about these boxes, It's a monthly subscription service, and you basically get all these geeky gamer items, pop culture items. You'll get, apparel, collectibles, all sorts of things, and each box has a different theme, and you have until the 19th at 9 p.m. Pacific time to subscribe and receive that month's crate. And I believe by the time you guys hear this, the July box will just be closing. This episode will come out on the 18th, so you will have to order quickly, or you can just wait and see what the next month's box is and order it after the 19th at 9 p.m. Again, that link is trylootcrate.com/geekdompod, and this is definitely an awesome deal, so bridge 10 for that 10% savings. Check it out. But back to the Captain America talk. Julie, I know I posted this in the Google Doc just this morning, but on FX Guide, they go through how they made Steve look like such a wimp, or more so made Chris Evans look like such a wimp at the beginning of the movie and everything when he is pre-serum. And
Yes.
it's definitely interesting. I think this might be one of the more interesting effects that they used for this entire film, simply because it's a lot of image manipulation, and I think the one thing they sort of went wrong with, I think if they would have changed his voice slightly too,
Yes.
it would have been a little better, because you see this tiny little man and it's like he has this sort of deeper voice, and I'm just like, that doesn't, like, Steve looks like how Steve should look, but he doesn't sound like how he should sound for being, that tiny person.
Yeah, it should have been a little bit like either a little bit higher or a little bit like, I don't know, less healthy sounding, less,
Yeah.
It actually it makes his head look bigger when you're like not really paying that close attention sometimes.
Yeah.
Like I'll put it on in the background and it makes you're like, wait, his head is really big for his body. And I mean, I think that's part of the point. Like, oh, he's supposed to look like a little bit like mismatched, but at the same time, like his voice probably would have been like the easiest thing to change. And the fact that they don't like the scene when he's being knocked out and he goes, I could do this all day, and then it's repeated in Civil War, it's exactly the same, and it shouldn't be.
Yeah.
But it's really really funny because like especially when you hear it, like there's been a lot of people, especially when that trailer came out, put like the two together. They were like, oh look, he's still the same guy, and it you hear it and you really, the first time you see it, you don't really necessarily notice that like his voice isn't 100% the way it should be, but
Right.
every rewatch it gets like worse because you're like, wait, why is like and everything he does, he doesn't even lower it. When he yells at the guy in the movie theater, he knows he's gonna get beat up. He knows he's gonna get beat up. It's what he does. He gets punched all the time. Bucky even says something about it, and it kind of, especially having like just seen Spider-Man and having that like context, like he sounds like a kid.
Yeah.
And I feel like, okay, well, Steve was an adult. He doesn't necessarily have to sound like a kid, but he should have sounded definitely a lot less like him. Like when he opened his mouth the first time after, like when he's in the thing and he says, I'm okay, just keep going. It should have come out differently. That should have been shocking. It should have already sounded different, but again, I think that's where like the movie was, they were focusing on him, becoming Captain America. And so the bigger focus became, oh, okay, he has to get strong. And, I think they missed little things. It would be very interesting if the movie came out now with what Marvel knows now.
Right.
And how different it would be. It wouldn't make sense, but.
And they didn't even necessarily have to raise his voice like a full octave or anything crazy like that. They could have just done it like, make it a little higher by a couple pitches or a couple notes or something like that. And I think it would have sounded a bit better just for the way he looked, because I know sometimes there are people, you'll look at them and then you'll hear them talk and it's just like it doesn't seem to match up with what you thought they were going to sound like in your head. And I think that was something I definitely noticed a lot more on a rewatch of it, because I hadn't watched this since whenever on earth the first time I watched it was. I don't
Oh,
think
really?
I don't think I was seeing these movies in theaters just yet. I probably watched it on TV or something at some point after it had already come out, because I wasn't quite as, adamant about watching them
Yeah.
as quickly. And I think it wasn't really until Avengers, or maybe even the second Captain America movie, that I was like, okay, I want to go see these in theater now. And I think with the visual effects, even though it was only 6 years ago, there's still been so many improvements in technology since then that I think, looking back at some of these movies that were trying to be more advanced in the technology they use and everything, sometimes it'll look a bit more off than, say, watching something like Star Wars from the 70s and 80s when they did the first trilogy and everything, because back then they didn't have like any of the technology. So they had people in costumes and they were doing all sorts of these things that didn't necessarily require visual effects done afterwards. And, this article, it does a really good job of showing you how exactly they did it. They have before and after photos, and then they have one with a body double in there. And I think, anyone who is interested in the visual effects aspect should definitely go read this article. And that sort of brings me to my next point, which is slow motion in superhero movies. I'm sort of really over it at this point, and I know it was used in Wonder Woman, like when she was crossing no man's land and stuff like that, but I feel like it's becoming increasingly unnecessary, because it's like, just show me the action in real time and it'll work just as well. It'll probably actually be more impressive in real time, because in real time I feel like you would be like, how did they do that? But when you make it slow, it's like, oh, that's how they did it. And that's sort of how I'm feeling with this. And I think the first time we really saw it here, he was like throwing a grenade into a ginormous tank and jumping off of it. And I was like, I don't know if I necessarily needed to see that in slow motion. And it's just one of those things where, especially in this movie, it could have cut down on some of the time they were spending doing things in slow motion.
Well, the funny thing is, so after the lab is attacked and he has to go running down the street, that is, I feel like, the pacing that the movie should have been. I mean, the
Yes.
scene itself lasts too long too, but he's still in his old clothes and he's a
No
bigger
shoes.
guy now. Yeah. Well, so Chris Evans runs really weird, and so they couldn't get a running double, so he had to do all his own running. That's one of the little other fun facts that I have about the movie.
I didn't know that.
Because he runs. Yeah, he runs really, really. I have an article about it. I'll send you. It's actually on Hidden Remote. He runs really straight.
Okay.
So it's not like your average person tends to like move their body like forward a little bit when propelling themselves forward. So they couldn't find someone who could run straight like him. So he had to do all of his own stunts in that regard. And so what's funny is that would have been a scene where you could kind of see them being like, oh, okay, let's do some slow motion because this is him in action for the first time.
Right.
And they don't. And what's interesting is, while I was talking, I was reminded, and I hate it. I mean, I hate a lot of it, but there's that scene in Age of Ultron that it opens with, that they're fighting, and like they're all in the same shot, and they're all doing some like signature move.
Yeah.
And it is not good. It does not work. It takes you out of the action. There's no sound because they want you to be like, ooh, how cool. And you really just sit there and go, okay, I'm over it. When are we getting to the next scene? Whereas like there were times in Avengers when they were fighting that they did use slow-mo, and I thought that it was effective because you couldn't really tell what was going on. And so I think there's a happy medium there, that like you don't have to do it for the cool, awesome action shot, or as the Deadpool would have a comment about this, which they
Right.
did. They used a lot of slow motion in that movie too. Um, they, I think that. I think that, I mean, I feel like the movie itself should have just been sped up a lot more anyway. But I definitely, I have some of that fatigue too. Like I said, I think it could work. I think it worked in the No Man's Land scene in Wonder Woman in particular. But I think that there are times, I'm trying to think of it right now, actually, having just seen Spider-Man again, and there's not a ton of like slow motion in it.
No.
And I think that worked really well, because I mean, it helped that Tom Holland was really like agility wise, he had the stunts, he could do most of them himself too. Um, so I think that they didn't necessarily need to like slow a shot down to show us what was going on. But I agree. I hope that they move away from it. Like, I don't need another shot of that in Infinity War.
Right.
Maybe it works good for a promo. I know that for Age of Ultron, there was a promo where they were like all doing something, and like Cap does like this like flip thing, and Thor is waving his hammer and everything, and it's not actually a scene that's in the movie. So like they can do that. That's fine. I don't mind, going to a movie and going, oh, I totally did not go for that scene anyway, so it's fine. But
Right.
overall, I definitely think they need to like slow down on the slowing down.
Yeah, and it's just one of those things that has sort of started bothering me more recently, because then you start to notice how much they use it, especially when you go back and watch things, which I'm normally not someone who will go back and reread a book or rewatch a movie, just because I've more so been doing something like that specifically for this podcast. It's like, okay, if I'm going to be talking about something I haven't watched in 5, 6 years, I'm going to go
Oh
back and
yeah.
watch that just to be sure I am talking about the correct things and everything. But otherwise, for me, I'm just like, there are way too many things to consume, all the content. Don't have time to rewatch stuff. I know I have some friends who will probably rewatch the same movie like 5, 6, 7 times, whatever. And, maybe Star Wars might be that only kind of movie that I'll rewatch multiple times for me, just because there's so many of them now and so much happens that in order to remember everything, you sort of just have to keep watching them. And even those, I've only rewatched, I think, the original trilogy twice. And I did not rewatch any of the second trilogy, and I have yet to rewatch either of the new ones. So we'll see how that goes. But for me, it's just like, okay, slow mo is just another thing at this point, making these movies even longer than they already are, and with them continuing to be like 2.5 hours now on a regular basis, I'm just like, I don't have time for this slow mo. Just give me the action, and it'll look a lot more impressive if they just do it in real time for a lot of scenes. Like, we really didn't need a slow motion jump of Captain America jumping off a tank. Like, that seemed unnecessary to me. I was like, just let him jump off the tank. Like, that doesn't need to. Not every explosion needs to be in slow motion. And you mentioned it with Deadpool, and I think if I'm remembering correctly, with Deadpool, he would like talk during the slow
Yeah.
motion. So
Well, it depended. Sometimes it was like just to like get the effect of like, oh, it's an explosion, or whatever was happening. But yeah, most of the time he would narrate, as if like he was watching it with us.
yeah, and I think for something like that, it's obviously a little different because they're doing that narration. But when it's just like, the explosion sounds and the effects and everything like that, and you're not really getting anything out of the slow motion, I think, just cut that stuff, just make it normal speed, do that, and you could definitely cut some time down on these movies.
Well,
But
it's funny, having just watched it, you'll be even more like, you'll have just seen the scene, but the scene when the after Cat rescues Bucky and the rest of the Howling Commandos, or who, the people who become the Howling Commandos, as they're walking back to the camp, and right, that scene right before that, they like decide to pronounce, Captain America dead or whatever they say. And as they're walking back, that scene is slow because everyone's walking, but
Right.
it's not in slow motion. And you feel the, like, in terms of a build, that was perfect because you're like, oh my gosh, he did it, everyone's back. And he's not at the, he's at the front of the, walking, but he looks just like the rest of them.
Yeah.
He's not in the, like, he's not in the really bright costume that they used for Avengers. He's, it's worn out now, and the scene looks really good. It comes out, and it's one of those scenes that you can't just like isolate it. You need the rest of the movie around it to have it. But, and you have, Bucky walking beside him. And the interesting thing is, while you were talking, I'm now curious how much they used it in Winter Soldier, because the one thing is that with Bucky also, they didn't use it wasn't really slow motion when he falls off the side of the train. In fact,
No.
he falls off and you have to kind of like move on. And you're like, what? But
Yeah.
this character who was with us this whole movie, and I mean, he's gonna, Steve's gonna have like a really bad reaction to it, because of course he would. And in part it leads to, all the other choices he makes. But you don't get, considering the pacing and all of that, considering that, and then everything else, you really don't get a moment at that point in the movie to go, oh my God, Bucky's dead. Like, and I think it's funny because if you look at like scenes that rely very heavily on that particular moment, like the Bucky reveal in Winter Soldier, it's not slow motion that they use the reveal. Bucky like flips over and then his mask comes off, and it's like, oh, it's Bucky. But they didn't really slow a lot of that down. And now I'm curious if they used it at all in Winter Soldier. That's why now I guess I have to watch that movie again.
We'll just have to have you back on for another podcast.
Okay. Yeah, I especially thinking about like they use it quite a bit in Civil War when they run at each other in the airport.
That was bad.
You're kind of like, oh my gosh, like, why
they did it again? Why?
Why is it taking 10 years? They weren't that far away from each other. They could hear each other perfectly. They didn't get a running start. They, Tony loses his patience and they go after each other. It's not, it shouldn't have taken that long. And I think it's interesting because, like, especially with, Civil War, you have the same, directors making the same choices as Winter Soldier. And now, like, that's why I'm wondering if I didn't notice it, or if it really, like, the storyline worked so much better in Winter Soldier that it, like, the slow motion works. You know what I mean? That's why, like, because the moments in Captain America, it's very jarring. It's very, when it should be slow, it's not. When it is, it's now I'm going to be really hyper aware of it.
I'm sorry, but there are instances, like you mentioned, Wonder Woman and No Man's Land, where it does work, and they didn't overdo it on that. It's like they gave you just enough to show you just what Wonder Woman was capable of, and it sort of allows all of the men to have a little moment to have this register in their head what exactly she's doing, and then be like, oh crap, we have to follow her. So
she had to fight for that scene, Patty Jenkins. They didn't want it.
Yeah.
I think also though, like, Wonder Woman does, they did like sped up shots too, like a lot of them, like when she does a lot of her fighting, it's sped up, which I think that in reverse would work in some of the Marvel movies. If they wanted to mix it up in terms of using like both, and in different scenes, I think that that would make it really interesting. But the fight sequences, the Marvel fight sequences, aren't really all that sped up. There's often a lot going on at once. um uh no matter, even in even if it's just just Captain America, there's a lot going on when it's the real, like, big fight scenes. But they could, I feel like if they tried that, if they mixed it up a little bit, like, oh, it's fast and then it's slow, and not like Matrix fast or slow.
Right,
Like,
right.
it's 2017, let's not do that. um I think that that might make some of the slow motion that doesn't work better, because, like you said, you're not really highlighting anything when you slow it down to show him, throwing a grenade.
Yeah.
You're not, what you're trying, what I get sometimes what is trying to be accomplished by the filmmakers, but then you again, you're taken out of it and you lose so much time, because it kind of reminds me of the end of the movie too. It's sad, it's really sad, actually. But
Right.
you spend, he knocks out Red Skull, and then gets him off the plane, and you're like, oh, okay, good, it's the end of the movie. And then those last few minutes you spend with Peggy and Steve. But even with that, that point in the movie, it's so earned. It's and that's part of it. I feel like sometimes those particular fight sequences, you're just not, it's not earned. But the lower key moments that do happen in real time are, I feel like, what's important. And so when you slow down a move or something, you're totally missing the bigger picture. That's why I think it's interesting, especially because I don't really, I remember the scene you're talking about, but it never really, like, registered as anything important. And I think it's interesting that it bothered you so much, because that really isn't something that needed to be slow. Whereas, like, even if they wanted to slow down, it is slow because they're talking. But if you wanted to slow down the scene when he goes into the water, at least you can see, like, okay, they're, like, drawing out all of our feelings.
Right.
You're not, especially because, like, fighting in particular isn't really, like, Steve does it because he has to. It's not something
He
even
doesn't
with,
enjoy it.
no, he picks a, he doesn't enjoy it. That's like the crux of, like, Civil War. He doesn't enjoy it at all.
Yeah.
He, he would much rather, sit around and have a, discussion. But he does it because he has to. And I think that's what I think also what makes it so interesting about, like, picking up the shield. But so, like, yeah, so highlighting a Steve moment where he's doing something superhero-y, that's not superhero-y. That's not superhero-y is Steve, telling Peggy that he doesn't know how to dance, and they'll dance. And it draws right back on that scene that you said is so good in the beginning of the movie with the two of them.
Yeah, and I think the fact that they pick the more, big explosions and everything to use slow motion for, but then they'll happily jump 70 years in, like, 30 seconds. It's just one of those weird things to me. And one other thing I want to note with the visual effects and everything, I did really like what they did with his motorcycle, how they had the fire coming out of it, and it sort of had all these little toys on it and everything, courtesy of Howard Stark. I think, we get a lot more of Howard's inventions and everything, and that in Agent Carter, which I think it actually would have been pretty cool to see a little more of that, simply because then we jump that 70 years and it's like, okay, well, then we just went from him to Tony Stark, in a matter of minutes there, timeline wise and everything. But I do think there are some very good visual effects in this, even if I'm not the biggest fan of having slow motion just for the sake of having slow motion. But before we talk about the post credit scene here, Is there anything we've missed that you want to make note of?
I let's see. We talked about Peggy and Steve, which is my favorite. They are my background on my iPad. It's some like fan art. Yeah, it's really cool. Let's see. And people keep making really intense comparisons to them and Diana and Steve Trevor, which I actually love. I think it's funny that they're so similar.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree on Howard. In fact, Howard, just to actually talk about him just for a second, is so fascinating because I talk about with a bunch of people. We've talked about like Marvel dads. Like Disney is. It's funny that Disney bought Marvel because they have like a mom issue in their movies, and it's kind of funny because like some of the mothers don't exist at all, or then you have like what happened to like Frigga and Thor and stuff like that. But there is a distinct, like, everyone has daddy issues in the Marvel universe, and it's bad. And Howard, though, is so interesting because he's such a likable character. And then, like, though, that, he never stopped looking for Steve, which totally put, a damper on even, Tony's growing up. And he, it's totally a shame that Agent Carter didn't get more time to do what it was trying to do, because even the idea of like Howard settling down is so funny to me, because he's this, he's Tony, just his father, so he's this billionaire playboy philanthropist, and seeing him get to play around and stuff. I think the one thing that Captain America misses is that Steve gets his shield pretty like late into the film, it makes perfect sense when he does, but we didn't really get to enjoy a lot of what Howard was doing. He was a part of making Steve, but he's out there tinkering with toys and stuff like that, and it's you forget that it's the 1940s, and I think that if the movie had given, because there is a Steve even says, I think it's in Civil War, he says something like, "Oh, I always liked your father," or something like that, and Tony was like, "Oh, I had no idea," or he knew who you were. Like, I feel like there was an unexplored dynamic there, because in Agent Carter, Howard even says something to Peggy about how like he loved Steve too, and the indelible mark that not Captain America left, but Steve Rogers, speaks so much to why Captain America works when they picked the right guy. But yeah, I think that Howard, I think they could make a series about Howard, and I would probably watch it, because as much as I don't like the way he treated Tony, I think that there's so much unexplored. I mean, he was maybe, Tony might be smarter. I think Tony might be a lot smarter, actually. But, even when Civil War was happening, there was all those jokes like, oh, well, Howard would be on, Team Cap. And I think that, like, when you think about that, it's very sad, but it's also, it's true. And it speaks to, the small group of people that saw Steve become what he is, and that's that part of the origin story that does work. And I think that Howard himself, plays such a huge part in that you forget, you forget that everything Steve does and he uses and stuff like that, it's all Stark technology. That's why I guess it's not so weird for him to work for SHIELD in Winter Soldier, because that was definitely, we'll definitely have to talk about Winter Soldier, because that was, I think, one of the more surprising things, seeing Steve like adjust to technology and all of that stuff.
Yeah, and you mentioned Tony probably being smarter than Howard, and I think because of all the advancements and everything, that sort of gives him the upper hand, I guess you could say. And, you know, he has Jarvis and everything like this. And Howard basically didn't have nearly as much to work with. So I think in that sense, it's probably more impressive what Howard was able to accomplish.
Right.
And he sort of created Steve in a big sense because it was his project with the military and everything, with the serum and making a super soldier. And, you know, he's there turning the knobs and, you know, everything like that. And it's almost like, you know, Steve was like his first kid or something
Right.
like that.
It was,
because,
absolutely. That's why I think Tony hates him a little bit.
yeah.
Because Steve came around and not just his first kid, but like the golden child, like the standard that no one could possibly ever reach for whatever reason that existed in Howard's head. But because he didn't idolize Steve because he didn't need to, but he definitely, it's very, you know, Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster, you know.
Yeah.
It's very, except that he loved him. He was proud of his creation. And, you know, and it's interesting because there is that line. He does tell Tony that, like, he's the greatest thing he's ever made or something like that. And in thinking about the fact that, like, Steve was the firstborn, that really feels very even more insincere than it is. And it is pretty insincere,
right?
Because he's equating, you know, Tony to mostly inanimate objects. I think that's definitely he's so Steve and Tony share dad in a way. That's interesting.
Yeah. Well, why don't we talk a little bit about the post-credit scene? This is something Marvel's been doing for a while, but one big difference I noticed about the ones they do now and this one specifically, there was a lot more text in this one, and they gave you the title of the next movie. So it was almost like it was more of a trailer for the Avengers, like a mini teaser sort of thing, than these sort of more cryptic post-credit scenes that they've started doing. And, you know, when I went to see Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, there were like 4 different scenes within the credits and after the credits. So, you know, sometimes maybe they get a little out of hand with them. But with this, it was very strange to see the title card and everything for the Avengers. But I did love the some assembly required part. If they would have just done that and not even given us the Avengers, I think it would have been a little more entertaining for me anyway. But what do you think of the post-credit scenes? Do you find them intriguing because of all these little Easter eggs they start putting in them now?
So I think I agree. I think that it would have been a lot better if they were a little bit more subtle, because the movie's already called Captain America: The First Avenger.
Right.
And what's interesting is I was actually surprised that Guardians of the Galaxy did what they did, because it's not like they didn't have any other Marvel movies coming out this year that they could have even, you know, the whole point of a post-credit scene, some of the best post-credit scenes are ones that have nothing to do with the movie. They are totally related to another movie. So I think that they could have even spaced out. I mean, they have Black Panther coming, they have Thor Ragnarok. So it's, you know, they had Spider-Man, which already had 2, and those 2 were actually kind of perfect. But so the older ones, like if you go all the way back to Iron Man and Nick Fury is in Stark Tower, there was something really novel about that. And I think that it's been interesting to watch them like change with the times, because now people expect it. Although I'm always shocked that people get up at the end of a Marvel movie. I don't understand it, because I'm fairly confident that everyone in the theater has not seen the movie yet. So I don't know why they're not staying, except that either they watched it online, which I think you miss out. And, you know, especially the one at the end of Spider-Man works so much better in a theater. But yeah, I think that I like the ones that they kind of leave you going, like the one that introduced us to Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch was really good because they spoke about a bunch of things, including Infinity Stones in that one, but also it had these, you know, two new characters that you knew were coming, and I think that was like a perfect way to, you know, segue into Age of Ultron. So I either like the ones that are like non sequiturs and have nothing to do with anything, or are just there for the laugh because they're perfect, and I like the ones that like right now we're heading into a lot of like really spoilery territory, not us specifically because we don't know what they're doing, but like they're not going to show us a lot of Infinity War related stuff. I know people are going to they know that the people at least who do commit to sitting there are going to sit there and expect something, and they are going to drag this out as long as they can so that they can keep their secrets as long as they can. And I totally understand that thinking, but I'll be curious to see what they do in the next, like, you know, year or two. They can't keep making the same jokes, like, oh haha, you sat for an after credit scene, but they can't really show us much, you know, especially because after I think it was the first Guardians, when they had Howard the Duck, and everyone was like, oh, he's getting his own movie, and they had to make all these statements, and they were like, no, I mean, he'll show up sometimes maybe, but no, he's not getting his own movie. I think that they have to be like very, very careful now because people are like misunderstanding the intent of these after credit scenes. You know, some of them are very like Winter Soldier was very specific, you know, that after credit scene where Bucky walks into the museum to essentially learn about himself. You know why? You know that in the story arc he has to know who Steve is. He has to. And I think that we've reached the point where we can't have scenes like that anymore, where they're so specifically character based that they're leading you to the next like plot point. Sort of worked in, you know, Spider-Man, but it will be interesting what they do. I think it's funny that after every like Spider-Man related, like when they had the after credit scene in Civil War, they said Spider-Man will return, and then they did it again after this movie. It's like they have to remind people, like they're like, we are making these movies now. And it's interesting because also people don't like, Marvel has had years to map some of this stuff out, and at least a couple of years ago, some of those scenes were filmed like a long time ago. I don't think that's so much the case anymore. But like, it's when people go to see DC movies, you know, it's not, they're competing now, but they haven't mapped out their world the same way, so there aren't always after credit scenes. And I kind of like that. I kind of like that there's like, you know, one franchise that you can go to and you know that you're going to have to sit there the whole time. And then there's one that you can go to and it's like, yay, the movie's over. We can leave. And we're not going to be teased. Because that's the other thing. Like, I don't need, you know, like especially like the way Captain America ends. I didn't need like a trailer at the end to tell me what was coming. You know, I think that, and again, they can't tell us certain things, you know, I think that certain after credit scenes would be really interesting. Like after Civil War, it would have been really funny. I mean, they're getting their own movies anyway, you know, Thor's getting his own movie, but it would have been funny to see like what he was up to while they were like fight. Like, was he watching them fight? You know what I mean? Like, yeah. It would have been like, there was some comedic opportunity that was like lost there. And it's the same thing, you know, with the Hulk. Like, I feel like, especially because Bruce was in the after credit scene for, I think it was Iron Man 3, when he says that, you know, I'm not that kind of doctor. You know, they've done a really good job of mixing, you know, funny with serious, which I guess is why there's always two, unless whoever decided that Guardians should have 5. But it's going to be very interesting also because, like, there's a lot of changes coming, and I don't think casual Marvel viewers understand that exactly, because it's, especially, I mean, contract talks and everything like that are always coming out. But even Doctor Strange, like, his after credit scenes were very funny because Thor was in it, but like, we haven't seen him since his movie. And I feel like that makes it really easy to like forget about him a little bit, especially because he's not really like a favorite, at least as far as I know. His movie got like kind of mixed reviews. I liked it though, but I think that like it would have, because they have a bunch of new characters, some who will never get their own movie, but then like a great example is that Captain Marvel has been supposed to come out in 2018, but it's now 2019. Are we going to see her in a post-credit scene? Like,
Right.
I think that she's in Infinity War. I do, but still, like, there's several movies coming out before Infinity War, and so I don't, I feel like because they have all these movies mapped out, and maybe they don't want to spoil certain things. I still feel like they could show us some things. Like, we should see Captain Marvel a little bit. They should start introducing that she's around. She's in the universe. She exists. Because while they make people really happy, I mean, I definitely enjoy the after credit scenes, but I think that they also, I don't know, there was a point where they definitely were a little bit more interesting. I'm glad we've reached the point where we're also cracking jokes when they make them, because I don't mind, going a little meta. But I think that, especially, thinking really in terms of Spider-Man, it was very centered on his movies, his story. It had almost nothing to do with the larger universe. They used to use them a little bit differently, and I guess they're, experimenting. So it'll be interesting what happens in, a year, two. It'll be interesting what happens after, even the first Infinity War comes out, because that, that already changes things, so we'll see. I think more than anything, they can't use Nick Fury for anything anymore as far as like extra scenes go.
Right.
And so it'll be interesting when we can kind of go back to that, because that's going to happen too. There's going to be other people who, join the Avengers and stuff like that. And I think it'll be fun, because it'll feel like a little bit of like a throwback to older scenes, which will be really interesting, because like Iron Man's turning 10. The universe itself is aging. So, it's definitely interesting, because they've learned a lot. I think that's why, if Spider-Man was made when Captain America was made, and I don't mean the other Spider-Man movies that were being made at that time, it would have been a very different movie than like what we got now.
Right.
And this, so, they're definitely, they're learning. It's slow, but I think that, I also think that few films, especially superhero movies, could be as like perfect as the way Winter Soldier is, because of the characters involved. So I think that, you're not really going to get as interesting. I mean, that's why even the post-credit scenes are interesting in that movie, because they're partially leading to somewhere else, but they're partially starting, they're starting up the story that is coming. So
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see what they do, because Thor Ragnarok is the next film, and it'll be interesting to see if they have that lead more into what's coming in Infinity War, simply because, Thor obviously takes place not on Earth, so that might be a better lead into something Infinity War related. But
or they used to have stuff with Thanos too. They don't
yeah.
really, they're not really showing him much lately either.
Yeah, I know they showed him in the first Guardians movie,
Yeah.
which makes sense because you get his daughters in the film. So to not show him in either of the Guardians movies would have been very strange. So I'm definitely looking forward to what they come up with. I don't know if I'm necessarily excited about Thor Ragnarok, but I'll probably go watch it just to watch it. I think the only movie in the Marvel Universe that I haven't watched yet is Doctor Strange, because I felt like it didn't tie in quite as much as the rest. I have
It
it.
doesn't.
I just
It
haven't
doesn't.
watched it. And like you said, mixed reviews and everything like that. But anyway, that's getting a little ways away from Captain America. But I will definitely be glad to have you back on for the Winter Soldier. I know now you probably want to talk about that even more. So we can definitely do that. But, I think this was definitely a great conversation. And I just want to thank you so much, Julie, for coming on to talk about this. Even though, this wasn't the best of the Marvel films and there were a lot of problems with it, I think there was still enough good to pluck out of it for, future films and everything like that, especially with the Peggy Cap storyline, the Cap Bucky storyline, and that sort of thing. So, again, thank you so much for coming on to talk about this.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. And to our listeners, as always, thank you all for listening, because without you listening, there probably wouldn't be a podcast. And if you guys could share this, just share the episodes you enjoy. I won't even ask for iTunes reviews. I mean, I think word of mouth is definitely the way to go for this. But if you guys could share it, that would be awesome. But in general, just thank you all for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.